a crucial corporate survival event. My name is Morgan, a data analyst approaching my 30th birthday, who has always been considered the ultimate failure inside my own household, simply because I refused to participate in the traditional family business. Our family logistics company was standing on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy while desperately needing an emergency franchise contract to maintain basic daily operations. Knowing the massive risks involved with this specific corporate partner, my older sister orchestrated a remarkably cheap theatrical performance of agonizing pain to escape her negotiation responsibilities. She actually wanted to throw me into the fire while secretly hoping to witness my miserable downfall so she could secure her superior position. She looked directly at me with a mocking smirk playing on her lips before delivering her ultimate challenge in front of our parents. You go to the contract signing instead of me to prove to our parents that you are not a completely useless freeloader. Instead of crying or running away from the intense pressure being forced upon me, I calmly accepted the thick negotiation folder with absolute coldness. I was entirely prepared to step into that corporate boardroom to show them the true face of their own catastrophic ignorance without revealing my actual strategy beforehand. Have you ever been pushed into a desperate corner by your own blood relatives just so they could turn your existence into a pathetic joke? Please leave a comment sharing your thoughts below as you keep listening to discover exactly how I brilliantly flipped the script during that high-stakes meeting to make them pay a devastatingly expensive price. That weekend family dinner unfolded in the familiar, suffocating atmosphere that always seemed to choke the dining room. My dad Lloyd had spent his entire life building a cold chain logistics company in Atlanta that was currently drowning in massive overdue debts. The financial situation had grown so catastrophic that the central bank was actively threatening to foreclose on all the mortgaged commercial properties. While they struggled desperately with the failing enterprise, I worked successfully as an independent data analyst, earning enough to comfortably support myself. However, my mom, Rosemary, constantly criticized my career choice because she believed I had betrayed our household's core values by choosing a different professional path. They both looked down on my analytical skills while blindly trusting my older sister Joanne, who held a senior executive position despite possessing zero management capabilities. Right in the middle of our tense meal, Joanne suddenly dropped her silver cutlery violently onto her porcelain plate, causing a sharp ringing sound. She aggressively grabbed both of her temples while contorting her face to complain loudly about an unbearable headache piercing her skull. Her theatrical performance was incredibly exaggerated as she leaned heavily against the dining chair while groaning about the immense stress destroying her physical health. Using this sudden, terrible condition as her ultimate excuse, she arrogantly declared that she was entirely canceling her attendance at the decisive corporate negotiation. This upcoming morning meeting with the Apex Corporation was supposed to be the final lifeline to save the crumbling logistics empire from total liquidation. Joanne showed absolutely no remorse while stating that her severe migraine made it physically impossible for her to comprehend any complex legal documents or sit through hours of intense bargaining. Dad and Mom immediately rushed over to coddle Joanne with a glass of water while expressing their deepest sympathies for her sudden suffering. Instead of holding her accountable for abandoning a critical survival meeting, they simultaneously turned their frustrated glares toward my side of the table. Dad forcefully grabbed the thick leather binder containing the complicated corporate franchise files and slammed it down next to my dinner plate. They completely stripped away my right to refuse by framing this absurd demand as a mandatory blood obligation to save the struggling household. "The meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning," Joanne sneered while rubbing her forehead with fake exhaustion. "You just need to sit perfectly still, nod your head properly, and not mess everything up." "Take it, Morgan," Dad commanded with a harsh tone that left absolutely no room for any logical argument. "This is exactly when the family needs your actual contribution, instead of those useless data charts you stare at all day." I stared down at the massive stack of confidential papers sitting beside my nearly empty plate while listening to their ridiculous justifications. Mom chimed in to support his unreasonable directive by claiming that my schedule was highly flexible anyway, since I only worked with numbers on a computer. She deliberately ignored the fact that I had my own demanding clients who relied on my independent consulting services to manage their supply chains. Their collective assumption that my time held absolutely no value compared to Joanne resting her supposedly pounding head was genuinely infuriating to witness. Joanne peeked through her fingers to gauge my reaction, while secretly harboring a smug expression that she quickly masked with another dramatic groan of discomfort. She wanted me to take the fall for whatever disastrous terms were hidden inside those pages, so she could easily blame me when the entire operation inevitably collapsed. They were essentially tossing me into a corporate shark tank without providing any background information or legal briefings regarding the Apex Corporation's actual intentions. Dad stood hovering over my chair with his arms crossed across his chest to physically intimidate me into accepting the heavy leather binder. He spoke at length about how the bank would lock the warehouse doors by the end of the month if this specific partnership failed to materialize. Mom began clearing the dinner plates around me while muttering passive-aggressive comments about children who refused to assist their struggling parents during times of extreme financial hardship. It became perfectly clear that fighting back verbally would only prolong this agonizing meal while giving Joanne more opportunities to play the helpless victim. I reached out to pull the heavy binder toward my chest while maintaining a completely neutral expression to hide my growing suspicion regarding the sudden urgency of this particular assignment. At 11 o'clock that night, I sat alone in my home office, with the desk lamp casting a harsh glare over the thick stack of documents Joanne had shoved into my hands. Instead of merely skimming the surface for tomorrow's meeting, I began inputting the financial figures into my specialized analysis models to cross-reference the reported data against historical benchmarks. Within less than an hour of work, I recognized an absurd and illogical discrepancy between the high operating costs of the cold storage units and the actual volume of stored inventory. The numbers on the pages appeared to have been clumsily manipulated by someone who did not expect a professional to verify the underlying mathematics or the logic of the supply chain. My professional instinct as a data analyst pushed me to find the ugly truth hidden behind the beautiful charts that Joanne had painted for Dad to admire blindly. I quickly grabbed my car keys and drove straight toward the industrial district on the outskirts of Atlanta through the silent midnight streets, while my mind raced with dark possibilities about the business. Upon arriving at the facility, I requested an immediate meeting with the warehouse manager Cole, who had remained loyal to our family since the very first days of the cold chain enterprise. Cole led me into the central control room with a visible look of worry, because he knew my appearance at such a late hour was not a casual social visit. He silently opened the internal server systems to provide me with authenticating evidence regarding the actual operational status of the storage zones that Joanne claimed were at maximum capacity. Cole leaned toward the screen and whispered, "Morgan, the system records show the inventory is full, but the reality is that warehouse sectors C and D have been completely empty since the beginning of last winter." I watched the screen with a mixture of anger and clarity before looking directly at him to respond. "She is not just faking the capacity reports, she is actually handing this entire company over to Apex to cover up a massive embezzlement deficit." The evidence was undeniable, as Cole pointed out that half of our massive refrigerated containers had been sitting completely vacant for 6 months, even though electricity costs were reported at their peak. I immediately fed this raw data into my laptop to run a risk analysis model and discovered a horrific truth regarding the Apex Corporation's intentions for our infrastructure. They had embedded sophisticated trap clauses within the franchise agreement designed to seize our entire warehouse network for a bargain price after an orchestrated bankruptcy. These legal terms were crafted to strip Dad of all control the moment any revenue decline was officially recorded in the upcoming quarter, which was practically guaranteed. Even more disturbing was my discovery of hidden data strings within the payment processing history, which clearly indicated that Joanne had been systematically faking maintenance invoices for the cooling systems. My older sister had been secretly tunneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into personal accounts through various shell companies that were supposedly providing fake equipment to the Atlanta facility. Every matching transaction record revealed a systematic betrayal by the person Dad trusted most, with the ultimate fate of the entire enterprise he had worked so hard to build. Joanne was not just lazy or incompetent, but she was a calculated fraudster, trying to sell out Dad's life's work just to erase the criminal evidence of her own reckless greed. I backed up every single piece of this evidence onto a portable hard drive, with my hands trembling from anger, while my mind remained perfectly sharp and focused on the task. Joanne's plan was to turn me into a sacrificial lamb who would unwittingly sign the death warrant for the family business during tomorrow's high-stakes morning session without knowing the truth. She firmly believed I would be nothing more than a silent doll who would nod obediently in front of the partners from Apex without ever noticing the financial trap. However, Joanne had made a fatal mistake by severely underestimating the professional capabilities of the younger sister she had always labeled as useless. I did not go back home to sleep but stayed at the warehouse office to draft an entirely new counter-proposal based on the factual cold storage numbers I now held. I knew that if I stepped back now, Dad's company would vanish into thin air and hundreds of local workers in Atlanta would lose their livelihoods because of Joanne's greed. The constant humming of the massive cooling system surrounding me served as a reminder of the heavy responsibility I was now carrying during these quiet hours. I would not let Joanne's scripted performance continue for a single second longer on the upcoming negotiation table at the corporate headquarters. This was no longer just a simple contract signing, but a desperate war to protect justice and unmask a traitor hiding under the guise of family loyalty. I finally closed my laptop as the first faint rays of dawn began to creep over the eastern horizon of Georgia. At 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the expansive glass-walled meeting room located on the 50th floor of the downtown trade center. Dexter, the senior representative of the Apex Corporation, sat at the head of the polished mahogany table with an air of undeniable superiority that filled the room. He immediately began pouring out a stream of complex macroeconomic financial terms and predatory legal jargon designed specifically to create psychological pressure on anyone unfamiliar with high-level negotiations. I maintained a completely calm composure while listening to his thinly veiled threats regarding the imminent collapse of my family's logistics infrastructure in Atlanta. Dexter leaned forward and pushed the heavy leather-bound folder toward me while tapping his expensive fountain pen against the signature line with an impatient rhythm. He looked me straight in the eyes with a patronizing smile as he claimed that my signature was the only thing standing between my father's legacy and total financial ruin. Dexter looked at me with cold calculation before saying, "Miss Morgan, the market fluctuates very quickly. Signing today is the only way for your company to avoid a bankruptcy order." I did not hesitate for a second as I pushed the pen back toward him and responded firmly, "Mr. Dexter, I am not here to sell off the control of the warehouse to Apex. I have a much more realistic revenue-sharing partnership plan that benefits both parties without sacrificing our autonomy." I did not waver under his intense gaze, but instead directly flipped the document over to page 15 to point my finger at the hidden asset transfer clause. I explained with absolute clarity how this specific paragraph was designed to orchestrate a hostile takeover of our cold storage facilities for a fraction of their actual market value. My voice remained steady and professional as I dissected the predatory interest rates hidden within the secondary footnotes of their supposed lifeline agreement. I pushed the fraudulent Apex contract to the far edge of the table with a decisive motion and replaced it with a comprehensive new proposal centered on transparent storage leasing agreements. This alternative plan outlined a clear profit-sharing model that would maintain our independence while providing Apex with the reliable logistics hub they desperately required for the southern region. Dexter's smug expression vanished instantly as he realized that I had spent the entire night dismantling their deceptive financial traps with surgical precision. He seemed genuinely shocked that a data analyst whom Joanne had described as a useless amateur could possess such a profound understanding of international contract law. Dexter slowly reached for his reading glasses and began to seriously scrutinize every single page of the detailed risk analysis report I had meticulously prepared. The room fell into a heavy silence as he studied the projected revenue streams and the ironclad protections I had built into the new partnership framework. He spent several minutes comparing my data sets against the fraudulent reports Joanne had previously submitted to their board during the initial discussions. I sat back in my chair with my arms crossed while watching him realize that his elaborate plan to steal the warehouse was effectively dead. Dexter occasionally looked up at me with a newfound respect that was previously absent from his condescending professional demeanor. He started taking notes on the margins of my proposal while nodding his head slowly, as if acknowledging the undeniable logic of my financial projections. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely in my favor within less than 20 minutes of our scheduled meeting time. I knew that I had him trapped because my proposal offered Apex a legitimate profit while protecting my father's business. 10 minutes later, just as Dexter began to nod his head in genuine agreement with my final financial projections, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom were suddenly thrown open with a violent force that echoed against the glass walls. I looked up to see Joanne walking into the room, followed closely by Dad, her face appearing remarkably rosy and healthy, without a single lingering trace of the crippling migraine she had used to avoid the meeting earlier. Joanne carried a smug and triumphant smirk on her lips, as if she were arriving just in time to witness my inevitable humiliation and the final signature on the original predatory contract. Her expression froze into a mask of pure confusion when she noticed the relaxed posture of the Apex representative and the way he was carefully circling the new terms I had drafted. The silence in the room became heavy with her growing realization that the situation was not unfolding according to the disastrous script she had carefully planned for my failure. Joanne screamed at the top of her lungs, "What on earth are you babbling about, Morgan? I told you to come here and follow Mr. Dexter's arrangements not to cause trouble and embarrass our family." Dexter looked up from my detailed proposal with a deep frown of disapproval as he witnessed her unhinged outburst in a professional environment meant for high-stakes corporate discussions. He watched with a mixture of shock and visible disgust as Joanne lunged across the table to snatch the documents out of my hands while screaming insults at my professional integrity. Dexter slowly closed his leather portfolio and stood up with a cold authority that immediately commanded the attention of everyone present in the room. Dexter looked at her and said, "Miss Joanne, your working style is incredibly unprofessional, and when your board of directors manages to unify your internal affairs, please feel free to contact me again." The sound of the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind Dexter left a deafening silence that was quickly filled by Joanne's shrill and irrational accusations as she threw the papers onto the floor. She did not seem to care that she had just driven away the only person capable of saving our logistics company from immediate financial liquidation. Joanne continued to point her finger aggressively at my face while screaming that I was the sole reason for destroying the vital relationship with our most important corporate partner. She turned toward Dad and began a frantic manipulation of the facts to make it seem as though my analytical approach was a deliberate act of sabotage against the household. Dad stood by the window with a look of utter defeat on his tired face, while Joanne continued her relentless verbal assault against my character as well as my professional motivations. She claimed that my arrogance had blinded me to the reality of their debt and that my interference would lead to hundreds of workers losing their jobs by the end of the week. Every word that came out of her mouth was a desperate attempt to shift the blame for her own incompetence and fraud onto my shoulders before the truth could be fully revealed. I stood my ground with a cold and detached expression while watching her unravel into a state of hysterical desperation that no longer held any power over my emotions. It was truly pathetic to see her prioritize her own fragile ego over the survival of the enterprise that Dad had worked his entire life to build from the ground up. Joanne ignored the reality of the situation and began pacing the room while muttering about how she would have to spend months repairing the damage my presence had caused in just 1 hour. She seemed entirely oblivious to the fact that her fake illness had been the catalyst for this entire confrontation, and that her presence had been the true deal-breaker for Dexter. The air in the cold boardroom felt thick with her toxic energy as she tried to reassert a dominance that had already vanished the moment I stepped into that room. I gathered my things without saying a single word, while her shrill voice continued to echo against the glass in a desperate search for someone to validate her lies. Immediately after that, while Joanne was still gasping for air from her latest hysterical outburst, the phone tucked inside Dad's vest pocket began to vibrate with a sudden and frantic urgency that compelled us all to stop. He fumbled with the device before finally hitting the speakerphone button, just as the cold and robotic voice of our primary bank representative filled the silent room with a message of total destruction. The voice calmly announced that the asset seizure protocol had been officially triggered and that all cold chain properties in the Atlanta area were being sealed to cover massive, undisclosed debts. Dad recoiled as if he had been physically struck, while the color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost, standing in the middle of his own ruined boardroom. He leaned heavily against the mahogany table for support, while his hands shook uncontrollably as the reality of losing his life's work finally began to sink into his mind. Dad shouted into the phone with a voice that was both desperate and filled with raw disbelief. "What? The bank cannot seal the warehouse. We haven't missed a single payment deadline." I did not wait for the bank official to offer a response. Before I moved toward the table and threw the stack of data reports I had printed at the warehouse directly onto the polished glass surface. Every single page in that pile was a documented proof of the calculated treachery that Joanne had been conducting behind his back for a very long time. I leaned toward him and spoke with a cold and unforgiving clarity that seemed to slice through the frantic tension of the moment. "The bank is doing exactly the right thing, Dad. Ask your golden daughter how she secretly mortgaged the cold storage system to cover up her embezzlement." The room fell into a heavy and suffocating silence as I pointed my finger directly at the distinctive ink of Joanne's signature on the private loan documents she had hidden from everyone. I explained with absolute precision how she had systematically faked maintenance invoices for the cooling systems to tunnel hundreds of thousands of dollars into her personal accounts to pay off her own failing investments. She had been treating his legacy like a personal piggy bank while allowing the actual infrastructure of the company to wither away into a state of total financial ruin. Joanne tried to offer a stammering defense, but her eyes were darting around the room like a cornered animal that had finally run out of clever tricks and lies to hide behind. At that exact moment, Mom came rushing through the door with an expression of pure panic that matched the chaotic energy radiating from everyone standing around the mahogany table. She had obviously heard the news from the bank and the weight of the crimes I had just revealed about her favorite daughter during this public confrontation. However, instead of showing any anger toward Joanne for her massive theft and betrayal, she lunged at me with a grip that was surprisingly strong and fueled by a deep and irrational rage. Mom began to cry hysterically while accusing me of being a heartless and vengeful child who was only interested in destroying my sister's reputation out of spite. She screamed that my cruelty in exposing Joanne was the real tragedy, and that I was the one responsible for the final collapse of our family's honor. It was truly disturbing to watch her prioritize a false sense of loyalty over the blatant criminal activity that had robbed our father of everything he had built. Mom continued to sob and shake me while demanding that I stop this calculated attack on the sister who had supposedly done everything for our family's success. 15 minutes later, the heavy atmosphere within the boardroom had shifted from chaotic accusations to a desperate and sickeningly sweet display of artificial manipulation. Dad and Mom suddenly changed their cold and distant attitudes by nearly 180 degrees as they crowded around me with fake smiles that did not reach their tired eyes. They began to plead with me using soft and trembling voices while begging me to immediately call Dexter and ask him to use the massive influence of the Apex Corporation to stop the bank's asset seizure. It was truly disgusting to watch them try to weaponize our shared bloodline after decades of treating me as an expendable failure who was not worthy of their basic respect or professional validation. They spoke of family honor and the legacy of the logistics company as if those things still held any meaning after the systematic betrayal I had just uncovered in the dark. Even though she was completely cornered by the evidence of her financial crimes, Joanne still stood there with her arms crossed in a defiant and shameless posture. She actually had the nerve to lift her chin and bark out a sharp command for me to stand up and resolve this disgusting mess for the sake of the family reputation. Joanne spoke as if it were my obvious and mandatory obligation as a younger sister to sweep away the consequences of her own illegal actions and her relentless, reckless greed. She seemed to believe that her previous insults were completely forgotten, now that she needed my professional credibility to keep herself out of a federal prison or a state of total bankruptcy. Mom reached out to grab my shoulders with her face contorted in a mask of artificial desperation while she whispered her pleas directly into my ear with a shaking voice. Mom said, "Morgan, you know Mr. Dexter. Please call him to save our family. I beg you." I pulled away from her touch with a sense of profound exhaustion and looked directly into her eyes with a coldness that finally silenced her frantic begging. I replied with a steady and unforgiving voice. "This family has been dead for a very long time already, Mom. Everyone in this room created this disaster together, so you should all learn to embrace it yourself, because I am finishing my mission here forever." I stood my ground while looking at each of them in turn and began to clearly list the 30 years of emotional wounds and the constant, unreasonable contempt that I had quietly endured. I spoke about every single time they had used my analytical mind for their own benefit, while publicly shaming me for not being as loyal as the criminal sitting next to them. I finally reached out and forcefully shook off Mom's grasping hands from the sleeve of my blazer with a sudden motion that sent her stumbling backward toward the mahogany table. I stood tall and officially declared that I was refusing every single one of their requests for help while formally cutting all ties with such a collection of hypocritical and rotten people. I reached down to grab the handle of my leather briefcase and turned my back on the people who had claimed to love me while systematically destroying my sense of worth for 3 decades. I walked toward the heavy boardroom doors with a firm and decisive stride, while refusing to acknowledge the desperate screams and the sound of furniture being violently broken in the background. I pressed the button for the elevator with a calm hand while listening to the distant sounds of my father finally realizing that his empire was gone because of the daughter he had cherished. Every step I took toward the exit felt like a heavy weight was being lifted from my chest after a lifetime of carrying their unfair and toxic expectations. 6 months later, the cold and unforgiving reality of the financial market had finally finished its work on the remnants of my family's legacy. The central banking system moved forward with the total foreclosure of every single property associated with the logistics enterprise after the legal deadlines for repayment had passed. Dad and Mom were officially declared bankrupt after the court determined that the level of debt incurred through Joanne's fraud was far beyond any hope of recovery. They were forced to watch as professional moving crews cleared out the expensive furniture from their luxury mansion while neighbors watched from behind closed curtains. They had to bitter-heartedly relocate to a cramped and dilapidated apartment complex on the far edges of the city, where the walls were thin and the elevators rarely functioned. It was a staggering fall from the high society of Atlanta to a life of counting every single penny just to afford basic heating. While our parents struggled with their new poverty, Joanne found herself facing the severe consequences of her systematic deception within the walls of a federal holding facility. The Economic Crimes Division of the local police had spent months building an ironclad case against her for massive corporate fraud and organized embezzlement of company assets. Every single fake invoice I had discovered during that midnight investigation served as a cornerstone for the criminal charges that were now being brought before a judge. Joanne was currently awaiting a sentencing hearing where she faced the very real possibility of a prison term lasting for many years in a high-security institution. She had tried to claim that her actions were a misguided attempt to save the business, but the paper trail of her personal luxuries proved otherwise. In sharp contrast to the ruins of my former household, I had successfully established my own independent supply chain data analysis firm within a modern office building downtown. The professional reputation I had earned during those intense negotiations with the Apex Corporation allowed me to secure several high-value clients within the first few weeks of operation. Dexter was so impressed by my foresight and my unwavering integrity that he personally oversaw the signing of a long-term strategic partnership between our organizations. My company provided the analytical backbone for his regional logistics hub, while he offered me the global reach that I needed to grow my enterprise into a success. I spent my days working with actual data and transparent financial models that were free from the toxic manipulation and the lies of my past. I made the final decision to change my phone number and blocked every single method of digital communication from my parents and their legal representatives to protect my peace. I no longer had to wake up to frantic messages of guilt or the manipulative pleas for financial assistance that had characterized our relationship since the company collapsed. Every afternoon, I enjoyed the quiet peace of my own apartment while watching the sunset over the Atlanta skyline without feeling the heavy weight of their unfair expectations. I had finally achieved a level of true freedom that was only possible by walking away from the people who viewed me as nothing more than a tool. Looking back at this journey, I have realized that there are 3 profound lessons that everyone should consider when dealing with toxic family dynamics and career struggles. First, you must never compromise with emotional abuse or the constant gaslighting of people who refuse to acknowledge your true professional worth, regardless of your shared bloodline. Second, your actual value is something that you must determine for yourself through your actions and your integrity, rather than letting a dysfunctional household define your limits. Finally, the decision to cut off toxic relatives is often the most compassionate act of self-preservation that a person can perform to protect their own future and mental health. These truths allowed me to rebuild my life from the ground up while ensuring that I would never again be a victim of someone else's greed. I want to thank every single one of you for listening to this entire story of betrayal and ultimate redemption until the very last word of the final chapter. What do you think about my decision to leave my family behind and start a new life without them after everything they did to me? Please share your honest thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe